Buongiorno a tutti e tutte. Hello everyone. Welcome to this panel entitled Translators as Cultural Mediators too, which I'm delighted to chair. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for a very inspiring conference so far. I'm sure it will go on with fascinating talks today. We only have 2 speakers for this session, so it is going to be a quite short panel. And I will start introducing our first speaker, Jeanne Sauvage, who is a PhD student in French at Yale University and a graduate of École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her research focuses on the cultural interactions between France and the US through the prism of translation practices and literary networks in the 20th century. Her main areas of interest include translation studies, transatlantic book history, and the novel in French and American literature. Her paper today is entitled My Little Name Beside Your Great Name, Marcel Sibon, Catherine Ann Porter, and the US Canon in France. Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also to the organizers for all the work that went into this wonderful event. So to get us started, I'd like to contextualize this presentation by pointing out that I first stumbled across Sibon's name a couple years ago while browsing the online catalog of the library of the University of Milan for the needs of my PhD dissertation. The manuscripts department holds 5 folders enclosing 200 pages of correspondence, from the American novelist and short story writer Catherine Ann Porter to her French translator, a certain Marcel Sibon. Sibon's side of the correspondence is kept at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., which holds a whopping total of 658 pages of correspondence. I remember feeling very excited to have finally got my hands on a female translator's archive, and a hefty one at that. It won't come as a huge surprise to anyone in this room that compared to other links in the editorial chain, translation is a heavily feminized labor. Yet the work of these women left a much thinner paper trail than that of their male counterparts. As translation scholar Susan Pickford aptly contends, translators' archives tend to signal an atypically high degree of literary capital. I quote, "The policies for acquiring translators' archives tend to focus on what we might call the elite of the profession. That is to say, translators who enjoy a high degree of agency, either because they translate authors with a high literary capital, or because they themselves have a high degree of intellectual and symbolic capital through their authorial or academic status." The very structure of archival records plays an important part in the gatekeeping of women out of translation history. For the translation scholar in general, and even more so for the researcher of women in translation, archives are often the byproduct of another archival process, to borrow the phrase of Patrick Yasson and Anthony Cordingley. Perusing the 100 of pages of the correspondence between Porter and Sibon, one of the many things I found fascinating about Sibon is how passionately vocal she was in her rejection of the Big Five, the 5 patron saints of American literature celebrated in France. Those were John Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck, and Erskine Caldwell. In the critical writings of the existentialist crowd, these names become synonymous with formal experimentation and modern narrative technique. All of them were published by the same Parisian publishing house, Éditions Gallimard, and had been discovered and in part translated by the same translator, Maurice Edgar Coindreau, which led Jean-Paul Sartre to famously declare in 1947 that la littérature américaine, c'est la littérature Coindreau. American literature, that's the literature of Coindreau. Incidentally, all these authors were men, published by men, translated mostly by men. All of them articulated a literature that was vernacular in theme, in atmosphere, and in language, taking its roots deep in American soil, be it Mississippi for Faulkner or New York City for Dos Passos. Sibon was a harsh critic of the rough image of American society depicted in their novels. Instead, she strove to impose a different canon, inspired by a classical school of American literature descending from Henry James. In what follows, I will strive to show how her indictment of the cultural narrative predicated on the Coindreau corpus complicates and enriches the history of the reception of US literature in France. I will explore some aspects of Sibon's pushback against a uniform American school, which I believe was enabled by her multifold role in channels of literary importation, seeing as she was at once Catherine Porter's translator, her literary advisor, and to some extent, her agent. Throughout this inquiry, my method combines translation studies and book history. Quoting from Norbert Backleitner's astute argument in his proposal to include book history in translation studies, I believe that if we regard translation as part of print culture, we must also take into account the general patterns of book production and consumption at the time in which they are produced. If we try to elucidate the international transfer of literature by way of translation, we have to reconstruct the relevant conditions of book production and distribution, including the expectations of publishers, editors, and readers in the target culture. Abiding by these methodological guidelines, I suggest that Sibon's struggle to circulate and publicize Porter's novels and short stories in France provides an interesting insight into the cultural, generic, and formal expectations of the French readership vis-à-vis American literature. So I'll start with a few biographical elements about Sibon. She was born in 1894 in the village of Tardets in the French Basque Country, less than 30 kilometers from the Spanish border. Until age 4, she only knew how to speak the regional language, Basque, then moved to Paris where she learned French. I was able to gather but little information about her education and about the motivation which led her to become a translator. In 1911, she was awarded a scholarship by the city of Paris to study in England for 1 academic year. A certified high school teacher, Sibon taught English and modern literature at a Catholic institution in the Loire region. Then, in 1917, at an all-girls high school in Toulon. She then moved to Douai, in the north of France, which she had to flee during the 1940 exodus to find refuge in Cap Ferret. After the liberation, Sibon moved to Paris, where she rented a 3-room apartment on the Quai Voltaire, facing the Louvre. Until 1980, she lived in this apartment, described in a letter to a student as a very peaceful house where, apart from myself, there are only 2 green parakeets, one window on the Louvre and the others overlooking a 19th-century courtyard full of light and silence. So here you can see a little sketch that Sibon included in her correspondence, which is punctuated by these drawings. Sibon and Porter's rich correspondence started in 1935. They met through their mutual friend Sylvia Beach, the founder of the legendary Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris. Their sustained dialogue lasted until their death, a few months apart, in 1980. These letters document a transatlantic friendship that was mainly epistolary, even though the 2 of them sometimes met up in Paris. Sibon's letters are caustic, affectionate, and written in impeccable English. They testify to her sarcastic, often self-deprecating sense of humor, and at the same time document the political and social anxieties of the occupation years in France. In a letter dated June 14, 1940, Sibon describes the bombing of Douai, which forced her to flee the city in the car of her headmistress. A few years later, her letters account for the daily life in France in the post-war period. At the Liberation, when everything was in short supply in Paris, Porter sent parcels filled with soap, coffee, and sugar, just as Margaret Mitchell, the best-selling author of Gone with the Wind, sent rice, cocoa, and cloves for Pierre-François Caillet's children. While these examples are not legion, they are frequent enough to suggest that after the war, the intellectual collaboration between author, and especially female authors, and translator was coupled with a political solidarity that shaped cultural conversations between France and the US. So beyond this personal relationship, the archive also sheds light on Sibon's role as an importer and critic of American literary production. In France, she was Porter's only translator, starting with a few short stories first published separately before coming out as a collection a few years later. L'Arbre de Judée, which appeared in the magazine Mesure in January 1936, and Hacienda, an abridged version of which appeared in the left-wing weekly Vendredi in August 1937. After the war, Maria Concepcion was featured in Ici Paris in November 1945, and A Bright Particular Faith in the 1947 anthology Écrit aux USA, Written in the USA, edited by Albert Guérard. 15 years later, in 1962, When Porter abandoned the short story genre to tackle novel writing with La Nef des Fous, it was again Sibon who worked on the French translation. The letters reveal that to a certain extent, the translating process was cooperative. At Sibon's request, Porter willingly elucidated some obscure terms such as milk leg or whirligigs, explained the difference between journalist and newspaperman, and even went so far as to write to the president of Jack Daniels to ask him about the role of sour mash in the process of whiskey making. Both Porter and Sibon considered these French translations as a form of collaboration. In July 1945, when she handed the manuscript of the translation of L'Arbre de Judée to Éditions du Pavois, Sibon wrote, "I shall feel very excited and elated when I see my little name beside your great name on the title page." Although Sibon likes to describe the solitude of her Parisian office, her practice belies the archetypal image of the solitary translator, alone with her manuscript. By contrast, her work is caught up in a network of literary sociability involving, among others, authors, agents, publishers, and critics. Indeed, throughout this collaboration, Sibon's role was not only that of a translator, but also verged on the tasks of a literary agent. It was she who placed Porter's short stories with magazines, thanks in part to her proximity to the renowned publisher Jean Paulhan. She again who convinced Pierre-François Caillé to publish 2 collections of short stories with Éditions du Pavois, of which he was literary director, L'Arbre de Judée in 1945 and Le Vin de Midi in 1948. In the early 1950s, disappointed by the lack of interest in Porter's books in France, Sibon urged her to leave her agent Jenny Bradley, who, she forcefully argued, had been too careless with distribution and advertising. Upon the death of her husband William, Jenny had taken over the Bradley agency, a disastrous succession, according to Sibon, who advised her friend to be represented by the Denise Clairoin agency instead. As for Éditions du Pavois, after Caillé's departure at the end of the 1940s, they were no longer good enough for Porter. Sibon recommended Paul Flamand at Éditions du Seuil, according to her, the only honest publishing house in Paris. As a result of Sibon's advice, the French edition of La Nef des Fous came out with Le Seuil in 1963. In her letters, Sibon enclosed the articles which the French press devoted to Porter. Although they were mainly laudatory, Sibon complains that they were far too few. According to her, this was in part due to Jenny Bradley's inertia, but that was not the only factor. In the French literary landscape of the mid-20th century, Porter's short story collections were difficult to put forward. For one, because public and publishers' opinion were not favorable to the genre. French readers, Sibon wrote Porter, are not overfond of short stories. I believe that Sibon has a point. In 1917, this has already been the rationale provided by Gaston Gallimard when he rejected Maurice Edgar Coindreau's translation of The Pastures of Heaven, a collection of short stories by John Steinbeck, suggesting he translates The Grapes of Wrath instead, which is quite a doorstopper of a novel. Secondly, Marcel Simon was convinced that Porter's short stories did not correspond to the model of American literature as it was standardized by Gallimard and Coindreau. This masculine, vulgar literature, that of Faulkner, that of Caldwell, soaked in violence and alcohol, was the canon that Sibon intended to supersede. In April 1945, in a letter to Porter, she deplored the miserabilism of the authors whom Coindreau translated for Gallimard. And here you have an example of her remarkable penmanship. The French public, she writes, has a sort of notion that American literature is all made up of drunks, miserable people feeding on raw turnips along inhospitable roads going west, gangsters and so on, talking the most appalling slang. Faulkner, Caldwell, Steinbeck and company are great, but no one will understand here that their language is one language, their view only one view. Fortunately, some intelligent people are awaking to the fact that there is another American literature, following the more classical lines of Henry James, for instance, and I am sure your stories will satisfy the more refined readers. Sibon reiterated a few days later, in In a letter dated May 18, 1945, I know a few intelligent people here who think that you ought to be made known as the representative of classical literature in America, as opposed to the rough, impressive, but terribly brutal and desperate expression Steinbeck, Caldwell, Faulkner, etc. have brought us, which to most reading milieu here are the only form of American prose. This American prose, her letters divide into two trends. A Jamesian school, whose refined expression and well-crafted plots Cibon admires, versus, you've guessed it, a new literature she deems populist, crude, and vernacular. It is implied that this inhospitable literature is also a men's literature, against which Cibon intends to impose a more feminine American corpus than little known and low esteemed by the French readership. As a caveat, I'd like to stress that I am by no means trying to make a case for Cibon as a feminist pioneer, as a couple of quotes suffice to clarify. As she argues in an interview given to Les Nouvelles Littéraires in 1950, no one is a translator of a single author, as some people believe, and this flexibility of adaptation is perhaps the result of femininity. Women are generally good translators because their qualities, sensitivity and intuition, and their shortcomings, lack of creative power, fear of modesty, or modesty about using them, are put to good use. In another letter to Porter, dating August 7, 1975, she also writes that the sea atmosphere in a travel novel by Calvin Canfield has to be translated by a man. So reflecting back on Cibon and Gallimard, of course she was not alone in criticizing the prevalence of the Coindreau corpus. In his book, Amérique, nous t'ignorons, Pierre Schaeffer writes, "What a service, both good and bad, he, Coindreau, has done for the French public, which is so fond of so-called American authors. Through this artificially carved prism, through this tasteful but very artificial selection of what is published overseas, we have had a completely refracted image of America." It's interesting to see how this literary canon was recused by translators who attempted to rewrite it, putting their authors forward in the process. For Cibon, this meant turning Porter into the embodiment of a classical strand of American prose inspired by Henry James, what Coindreau had called the genteel tradition of American literature. This filiation was acknowledged, if not claimed, by the author. Porter said in an interview that James had been her introduction into modern literature, and she made no secret of her admiration for him. Her collection of critical essays, The Days Before, published in 1952, opened with a long piece on James in which she praises his rigorous attention to technique and psychological realism, both of which durably influenced her own writing. This framing of Porter as a classical writer was readily taken up by French critics. In February 1946, a review of L'Arbre de Judée, published in La Gazette des Lettres, read, "When a writer brings, along with an expression of life, a style that English classical writers would not have denied, a precise awareness of form, a taste for the right word, critics across the Atlantic hail a great stylist." This is what happened in 1930, when Catherine Ann Porter published a book of which Marcel Cibon now gives us an honorable translation. So as a few words of conclusion, a few decades later, in retrospect, it goes without saying that the Coindreau literature made up of Dos Passos, Faulkner, Hemingway, and Steinbeck has done more to shape the French cultural imagination of the US than the short stories and novels of Catherine Ann Porter. Arguably, the exotic figure of the American novelist as a violent, primitive, alcoholic loner is quite persistent, as the Faulkner scholar Jacques Potier noticed. Every day, even today, he writes, "Don't French readers just love American writers who verify and cultivate this stereotype, like Jim Harrison or Bret Easton Ellis?" Yet Marcel Cibon's efforts to rival the Gallimard corpus enriches the history of the reception of American literature in France. They give flesh to the discordant voices that complicate a monolithic Coindreau narrative. Retracing her life, work, and connections contribute to a different microhistory of transatlantic transfers by uncovering the individual stories that make the fabric of a cultural history of translation. Sibon's involvement at every stage of Porter's publication in France also underlines the central part played by translators in the mechanism of literary importation. They were in turn prescribers for publishing houses, agents, and literary advisors, in addition to the translation activity. And as such, they form an essential link in transnational cultural conversations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jeanne, for your talk. As a book historian, I'm very much in support of your approach. And thank you also for sticking to the times. And now we will move on to our next speaker, who is Przemysław Pozar. I hope I got it correct. He is a fifth-year PhD student in literary studies at the Doctoral School of Humanities at the University of Warsaw. His doctoral thesis focuses on the translators and translations of Shakespeare's canon in the Polish People's Republic. He also works as a co-investigator in the large-scale research project A Century of Translation, Translators and Their Work in Polish Literature After 1918, supervised by Prof. Magda Heidel. His paper today is entitled Diaries Kept, Applications Filled and Reports Submitted, the archival image of Maria Olszanska, 1915-2003, translator of Swedish literature in the Polish People's Republic. And the floor is yours, Przemysław.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be here today and present to you the results of my recent research. Before I begin, I'd just like to point out, as have been already alluded to in the introduction, that this research is part of an ongoing large-scale translation history project entitled A Century of Translation, led by Professor Magda Heidel at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And just to give you a teeny tiny glimpse of what we are striving for, we aim to write a history of literary translation in Poland after 1918 that stands against the marginalization of literary translators, whom we see as crucial actors of intercultural mediation and consequently of the development of modern literature in Poland. Naturally, we are aware that the group of literary translators has its own inner biases and discrepancies, and that's why we focus on peripheries, unheard voices, gender inequalities, and invisibilities, heeding to the inclusivity principle as much as we can. I have joined the research group only last year, and I have been tasked to do the archaeological work, that is to say, to retrieve information and material from various archival repositories about the post-war period, war denoting here the Second World War, and the subsequent years when Poland became one of the so-called satellite states of the Soviet Union. Sorry, is this my water? I hope so. Essentially turning into something of a communist regime. And within that time frame, I have chosen to look into Swedish literature myself, and because I have quite personal and practical interest in it. Someday I would like to research deeper into the reception of the working class literature, Swedish working class literature in Polish People's Republic. Right, so after this longish introduction, let us move to the matter at hand. The title of this paper, Diaries Kept, Applications Filled and Reports Submitted, reflects the idea that one could perhaps orchestrate a colloquy between different archival repositories in order to be able to sketch a somewhat detailed portrait of Maria Olszanska. Two caveats, however, need to be made here. First, detailed does not equal comprehensive nor complete. But secondly, archives of ordinary women translators, which I believe Maria Olszanska belongs to, tend to be scarce, fragmentary, or hardly existing at all. So I'd like to just acknowledge in the beginning that the one that I'm presenting here today is quite a unique treasure trove of archival material. So to sketch the portrait of Maria Olszańska, I have gathered material from 3 sources. First, the Library of Polish Writers' Union, specifically its translators section. So the eponymous applications and reports originate there. Secondly, I have also analyzed one of many volumes of Maria Olszańska's diary that she kept writing for over 4 decades. And lastly, not included in the title, is the correspondence with one of the publishing houses Olszańska had worked with. These are the thumbnails of the other archival repositories. So, what do we know about Olszańska from the get-go? This picture, by the way, is the membership card that she received and had to renew 3 times. Membership card of the Polish Writers' Union. She was born in 1915, and before the war broke out, she studied history in Warsaw and worked as teacher. During the war, she managed reasonably well, until in 1944, she was detained for conspiracy and deported to Auschwitz and later on to Ravensbrück concentration camp. After the camp was liberated, she found herself on a Red Cross bus to Sweden, where she spent 3 years on intense recovery. Having come back to Poland, she took up studies again, and in 1952 she graduated in Polish studies and quickly found a job as editor in one of the largest and most prominent publishing houses in the Polish People's Republic. The job, by the way, she carried on with until her retirement in the late 1970s. So her career as translator wouldn't begin until 1963. Starting with crime fiction that you can see in red, and children's literature, bold green, there soon appeared more ambitious titles, which I have put in blue. Especially Harry Martinson and Lars Ahlin, the names at the bottom of the slide, are considered to be the modern classics. Hierarchy, or the sense that some books are more equal than others, is implied here deliberately. When Olszańska first applied to join the Polish Writers' Union in 1965, she was declined on the ground that her work did not present enough cultural value. And that's what she sent. A modest, concise resume that you can see to the right, and a list of her publications to go along with it. We learn about the decline only from the appeal that she lodged, and in which she offers a staunch stance on the quality and import of her work. And here you can see the fragment of her appeal and the quotation that she puts in it. The justification of the decline, that is to say. Interestingly, her appeal reveals a lot more, not only about Olszańska's skillful and witty self-management, but also we learn about the difficulties of being a translator of the so-called minor literature, a group to which Swedish literature had certainly belonged back then. Let me quote the appeal at length now. And so she says, "Among the books that I have translated are those that may not have bearing on the culture itself. They rather meet the need of the literary market. But there also are, predominantly, short stories and novels of the most prominent modern writers, as well as the classics." And so she lists the names as well. "I do not think that the phrase, 'the work is not contributing to the enrichment of Polish culture,' could ever pertain to translation, as it inevitably always enriches the target culture. A token of that being the fact that the translators remain majority of Polish Writers' Union members. Nor do I think that the phrase might be a covert negative assessment of my translations, as for more than a decade my work as editor consists of assessing, editing, and correcting the imperfect translations, or educating myself while dealing with the perfect ones." And then she carries on. "It is commonly acknowledged that when it comes to the literatures of major languages, the translatory initiative has been long since overtaken by the publishing houses, having at their disposal proper array of books and lectures. It is only within the scope of small literatures that the translator still is the initiator, the source, the publisher's advisor, thus essentially adopting a par excellence cultural role. When it comes to Swedish literature, up until now, the role has been solely played by Mr. Zygmunt Wanowski. Now, there are two of us, she seems to be implying here. The lack of translators from small languages is so alarming, she says, that as far as I know, Polish Writers' Union is considering running a project to educate candidates for translators by delegating them to appropriate language courses. Bearing that in mind, is it tenable to leave out of the union a translator who studied the literature and language out of her own interest and has already more than 10 translations published? And so the appeal worked, and she was admitted, and it might just be the case that from that point on it was smooth sailing for her, for the only other documents we may find in that file are pertaining to the granted research stays in Sweden that testify to her role as a diligent cultural mediator. And here, for example, you can see a planned itinerary of her 10-day stay somewhere in the 1967. So she plans to attend a course, language or literary course. She also plans to meet with the representatives of Swedish publishing houses, Bonniers and Norstedt being one of, if not the most prestigious ones, as well as a meeting with translators and experts on Polish literature. There is also a small fragment on her special wishes where she says that she is interested in the so-called Swedish historical tales and would like a couple of days extra to work at a library. And also we have a report from another trip. This is a couple of years later in 1973, where she says what she has managed to accomplish during that stay. And among other things, she says that she exchanged information on Wordsworth translating from Polish, and she accepted some tips from translators and academics about modern Swedish literature. She met with one professor who specializes in Polish poetry. She spoke with several publishers, and she gave an interview to one of the Swedish newspapers. So that's, let's say, the official or the public image of Maria Olszańska. And let me now get to the more private one. So her diary is an enormous collection. My concern today is only the 7th volume, but the whole collection consists of 32 volumes, each notebook about 200 pages long. Olszańska begins writing in 1957, and ends before the turn of the millennia. Interestingly, the diary has been donated to the National Library, one of the most prestigious institutions, by the translator herself, only a year or so after finishing her last entry in 1998. It was intended to be archived already in 1969, which we learn about from the volume 7 I'll now present in detail. So Olszańska records an array of events, political, global, and private. But what strikes me the most is that, first and foremost, it seems a testimony to her improving material and social status. A testimony, if you'll allow me a brief sociological reflection, of the process of acquiring capital, climbing the class ladder. Olszańska eagerly recalls parties and gossips, notes what other women are wearing, what they serve to eat and drink during the parties, how big of a flat the host has or the hostess has, what their husband does, or what family they stem from. Olszańska provides also accounts of how much she earns and sometimes what the money goes to as well. Lavish coats or expensive leather boots she doesn't need. All this allowing a glimpse perhaps to the rising consumerist practice in the early 1970s in the Polish People's Republic. As I have mentioned already, this volume is also a very self-conscious one. So here you also can see the instructions of how to read the diary left by Olszańska and a brief summary of the contents of each of the volume. Sorry. So there are some general instructions, but the 7th volume is the one that I think completely breaks the fourth wall, if I may call it like that, and inaugurates the diary as a life-writing project on the borderline between public and private. And so here's the entry that I'm here talking about. Yesterday I have read that notebook with my diary entries. So she talks about the first diary that she has ever written. It contains the period between May 1957 and May 1958. I have found my writing quite enticing and vivid. It reads well and has a lot of interesting stuff. Perhaps my diary, found in years' time, could be made for a contribution to the history of our time, and an interesting read at that. I have also found that my hand was a lot clearer back then, and my style a lot less shoddy. Interestingly, translation is rarely mentioned and comes in snippets only. Entries on her practice are scarce and scattered, and when it is the topic of her notes, it is always characterized as petty or imperfect. The process itself, more often than not, laborious and dreary. And here are just 2 examples of those entries that pertain to translation. So the first one is quite short. Today I worked well. I have already received the finished short stories to translate. I like small things like these. And then in 70s she says, I have decided, so revealing a bit more about her practice, I have decided to do the short stories and the crime fiction during my office hours, that is to say when she's in the publishing house office, and finish Martinson and Lindgren while I'm home. I will make it on time. Next year, the 71, I would only have La Chaline, and I would finally be rid of that nightmare. Then I'll get Enquist's The Magnetist's Fifth Winter. So she also has some insight into the publishing house publishing plans, and Enquist is one of those sort of big names or popular names in modern Swedish literature. Olszańska translatory practice can be further explored from the vantage point of a correspondence with Wydawnictwo Poznańskie, a publishing house that specialized in Scandinavian literature. Their archive is very well preserved, with contracts, letters, and internal reviews readily available. So in the first example, she tries to explain why she did not meet the deadline but is unable to put the finger on the emotion accompanying the translation process. Perhaps we would say that she's feeling the burnout or something like that today. And so she says, the book is difficult, but I have translated more challenging ones. It doesn't arouse any enthusiasm in me, but I have had the chance to translate books I didn't like at all. My reluctance to this book is irrational, really. And important to say, perhaps, is that this correspondence is aimed to one of the editors, female editors, in Wydawnictwo Poznańskie, with whom she could trust with these kind of sharings. And so in another letter, quite early on in her career, she's requesting a deadline change with a very down-to-earth approach. She says, I do not enjoy working with a schedule so tight that an extra ticket trip or unforeseen flu threatens the deadline. I kindly ask you to change the date in the contract. Sorry, theatre trip, not a ticket trip, it should say, sorry. These 2 letters, though they might seem like nothing out of the ordinary, may actually corroborate need to set the archives in dialogue and search the diary for specific reasons as to why she felt the way she did towards her practice and why she needed so much to preserve the work-life balance. So to recap, the proposed colloquy between different archival sources lets us see Maria Olszańska, an ordinary woman translator of minor literature, tackling with institutions and bravely standing her ground, working on the intercultural dialogue and striving to educate herself further. We see her negotiating between private and public in her letters to the publisher, and finally, we may observe how Olszańska attempts, via partly self-fashioned life writing, to preserve something for the posterity, a record of material success and the cultural history of women emancipation through translating and editing in Central and Eastern European country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was kind of fascinated by the self-consciousness and self-representation of this woman, which is quite unique, I would say. So thank you for letting us know about her. And now I open the floor for questions. I think you need to come. Do we have a... Okay.
Thank you for your two presentations. Jeanne, I have a small question for you. Maybe you mentioned it, but I'm not sure. How did Sibon and Porter meet? Was it only by writing, or did she actually meet in real life? I mean, it's very anecdotal, but I'm very curious. Yeah.
Thank you. They actually met through Sylvia Beach, who introduced them to each other in the, I'm not sure of the exact date, but I believe it was in the early 1930s.
So that would have been in Paris then?
Probably. Before the war, Porter traveled to Paris a lot.
Okay.
Obviously, and that was precluded during World War II, but I think they met in Paris and in the Basque country quite a few times in the 1950s and 1960s.
That's interesting how Shakespeare & Co. was then sort of a hub where, writers and translators would meet. I mean, yeah, okay. So thank you for this precision.
Sure.
I might have a comment and a question. A comment for Joanne. Very interesting talk. The same novel by Porter was published in Italian in 1964, so just after the French edition, and I wonder whether they decided to translate it also because of the success it had in France, whereas yesterday we heard by the translator from French into Italian, the trend is the reverse, so we look at French novels that have success in America before we imported in Italian. But by the way, and in Italy, Porter was presented as the female companion of Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald. So this is very interesting. So we're looking at what was happening in France, but with a different perspective. And for talking about Olszańska, I think you have a treasure there, which I really envy. And I was wondering whether, from what you've already studied and could see, whether the diaries also contain information about the network, like other translators, so other important figure in the field, and so therefore they are relevant not only to better understand her as a translator, but also to kind of build up a map of agents and translators.
Unfortunately, not. So, but this is also the place where I complain about National Library, because I've been only able to retrieve the 7th volume that I've been talking about. I have scanned it way back, and in the meantime, they have withdrawn the whole collection to digitalize it. So it's supposed to be easier, but it's not. To be able to access the diary now, you have to planned the whole trip, and it is only available in the library. So I haven't been able to really go through other diaries yet, but I hope I will find something more on the translation practice itself, because it felt a bit underwhelming to find only this. Well, underwhelming, but also telling, of course, to find only this snippets and of reflection, self-reflection on her own translation, which gave me the sense that she's really overwhelmed with different tasks that she has, both at the publishing house and as a translator. And also the last repository that I have mentioned, the publishing house one. It's very well preserved, as I have already said, but it also gives you a glimpse of just how tight schedule she had when it came to translations, and when important titles from the literary market perspective came in, she would have to just toss everything to the side and focus on that one title. For example, it was the case with Ingmar Bergman's scenes of, what is his name in English? Scener över ett äktenskap. Of a marriage. Yeah. So yeah, because the publisher knew that they were filmatizing it, the scenario, so she had to do it really quickly. And you could also see in the translation that its language is actually quite dated. So it has a sense of being written not in 1970s, but perhaps in 1930s or 20s. And it's because she was simultaneously translating a historical novel by Victor Moberg, and there she used an old version of Polish, so to speak, so the one that dated back to 16th or 17th century, to actually give a sense of what it would be like to, read a historical Swedish novel and stuff. And so it's sort of that tight schedule sort of made its way into her strategies. Unconsciously perhaps, but there is such a trajectory to uncover thanks to different archival sources. Thank you for the question.
Are there questions? Okay, so we can perhaps go on with discussion after today. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I could have put together a speak of 30 minutes. Okay. this thing on? Yeah? Doesn't sound like it. Yes. I can speak very loudly if you want, no? Okay. Okay, so I'm happy to chair this session. There are two speakers, Jarda and Marion. We'll start with Jarda. You have her title there, The Woman Translator Behind Ellen Key's International Success. And Jarda, short bio, PhD student at the Institute for Interpreting and Translation Studies in Stockholm University, with main research interests in translator studies, translator biographies, translation history, and archive studies. And her PhD project is on the Austrian translator Marie François. Otherwise, University of Bologna, Forlì, with English, German, and Portuguese as an undergraduate. So are your professors sitting in the room here?
Some of them.
Yeah, okay. MA in Conference Interpreting, University of Mainz in Germersheim, with Italian, German, and English. And now you must be operating in Swedish already.
Yes,
Yeah.
I am.
Okay,
yes.
good. Go ahead.
But, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I can begin by saying that although the material is in German and Swedish, I have translated...
Yeah, you have to move the thing almost in front of your face.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right, sorry. I'll start over. So, although the material is in Swedish and German, I have translated the quotes into English. So those you'll see are my translations. And today's presentation will be about the relationship between the German translator Marie François. I can specify saying translator into German. She was actually Austrian from Vienna, and Ellen Key. So you can see both of them here on the screen. And I will try to investigate how this 30-year-long relationship evolved over time. Now, I don't think you have heard about Marie François. She is, we could say, completely forgotten nowadays, but she played a pivotal role at the turn of the last century, so 20th century, so in introducing Swedish literature, contemporary literature, to the larger audience of the German-speaking countries, thus making it available outside of Scandinavia. Just an overview of the content. Okay. So I will give you some background information just to know who we're talking about Marie François and Ellen Key. And then I'll present my aim and research questions to then move on to the material I used and what method. And then we will dive in the proper analysis and I'll draw some conclusions. So, who was Marie François? She was born and bred in Vienna, and her family was Jewish, originally from the eastern part of the Habsburg Empire. So her parents' hometown was called, or is still called, Brody, and it is in Galicia, and today it is in the Ukraine. But as I was saying, she lived her whole life in Vienna, and I think it's important to remember that Vienna at the time was the capital of the multicultural and multilingual Habsburg Empire, and this empire had 50 million people. Nowadays Austria has like 9 million people, and it attracted, Vienna as a capital attracted talent from all over the empire, but also from the German Empire and from abroad in general. So it was within this very stimulating environment that François grew up in and worked in. And she had access to the women's salons of the time, and through the male members of her family, she also had connections to the press, which of course were really convenient for her work as a translator. The first translation that I could identify in the press, we don't have any bibliography of her work for now, dates from 1894, and the correspondence with the Swedish author Ellen Key starts in 1895, but by reading the letter it's clear that it's not the very first one in the correspondence, so this might have started earlier the same year or maybe the year before. Anyways, around the time when she started translating. And she was engaged in the so-called bourgeois feminist movement in Vienna, so not the extremist type of feminist movement. She was a member of the Allgemeine Österreichischer Frauenverein, so the General Austrian Women's Association. And she published her translations in the two magazines of this association, which were called Dokumente der Frauen, so women's documents, and Neues Frauenleben, so new women's life. And then in 1902, a more umbrella association was founded, the Bund Österreichischer Frauenvereine, and the former association became a part of it, so that automatically Frances also became a part of this one. And she was in the provisional board of the first women's club in Vienna, the Erste Wiener Frauenclub, and she was also the librarian of this club. Now, on to Ellen Key. So she was born within a wealthy Swedish family of landowners from Småland, where they had an estate, so not from the capital, not Stockholm. And she grew up in a literary milieu where culture and literature were important for, even if she was a girl, she was educated at home. And when her father became an MP, she, as the eldest daughter, was the one who followed him to Stockholm to be his housekeeper, and that's how she got connections to the literary circles in the capital. You might know that she was a so-called difference feminist and an intellectual. She founded a network for women called Tolfterna, the 12, and also a women's society, Nya Iden. And she also was an important figure for the modern breakthrough, so this literary movement that was quite important in Scandinavia at the time. And she was also an advocate for children, a child-centered approach to education, and a suffragist. So today's presentation explores the role that Frances' engagement in the bourgeois feminist movement in Vienna had in reaching out to Ellen Key and starting translating her essays and writings. And yes, so these are my research questions, and I will get back to them in the conclusions. The material that I used is basically the correspondence between the two. There are 19 letters from the translator to the author kept in Stockholm at the Swedish National Library, which you can see here. And they are, in the beginning, in a mix of Scandinavian, I would say. So it's hard to understand if it's Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian. So I call it Frances' own mix of Scandinavian languages, which she learned autodidactically, so that might explain the mix. And then after a while, she just writes in German because Kay had like German nannies, so she understood the language. And they date from 1895 till 1919. And then there are way more in France's own estate at the Austrian National Library. It's 175 letters. And the first one, or very many of them, are not dated, but thanks to what I would call contextual elements in them, I was able to give them a year, more or less. So the earlier ones are from 1901, and then they go on up until 1923, although I do believe that they were in contact even after that. Kay died in 1926. And they are in Swedish and German, depending on the author's preferences, really. Here we have some examples. So to your left, there's Frances' Scandinavian, and then German here to the right. So yeah, quite easy to read. And then this is what Kay's letters can look like most of the time. This is quite an extreme example, so she was not shy in using the whole space on the page. So basically she wrote like normally downwards, and then, oh, but I still have something to say, so she rotated the page and started horizontally, and then with a different color, which I must say is quite clever, because then it was easier for me to read. And this is Swedish now. Right. So the method that I used to understand what was going on in the letters is thematic analysis. So I started deductively looking for 3 categories, those of networks, translatorial identity and image, and working conditions. And then once I coded the material in the software NVivo, just to have a better overview of everything, I proceeded to find patterns in the data, and I created themes inductively. So what I thought were patterns that could be relevant, and I named the themes after what I thought was interesting and appropriate, I would say. So, but let's see the thematic analysis. I will proceed by category. So when it comes to network, I wanted to figure out what importance it had in building and promoting the relationship, and I also wanted to see how instrumental case contacts on the one hand and Frances on the other one were for their success as a translator and as an author, because it is a fact that they both reached the peak of their careers after they met and starting their collaboration. And here we have the themes, and then in italics the sub-themes, and I will present those that are relevant for today's presentation. I call the first one Our Mutual Friends. So what happens is that very often mutual acquaintances and friends are mentioned, perhaps to get an update on them, or to send them greetings via one another. And so what is noticeable is that when the author and the translator met, they had 2 separate social networks, and then over time they merged into one shared one. So they both became acquainted with each other's connections. And we can already see the blurred lines between the professional and the private life of the 2 individuals. So I will read the quote. First, maybe a little bit of context. Kay visited Vienna in 1901, and she stayed for 2 weeks during the summer. And so in December she writes, "With all my heart, I wish you and your dear family, your mother and your brother, and Walter Fürst, a Merry Christmas. And to all our mutual friends, I wish the same." And then we have a list of people, mostly women. So what happens here is that Kay clearly has met Frances' family. Her father was already dead, so mother and brother. And Walter Fürst is Frances' cousin, so enlarged family as well. And then the women that are listed were all involved in the feminist movement at the time. And so we can see how they all knew each other, basically. And then we have one sub-theme that I named Frances the Introductor, and this is one side of the coin. We'll see the other one later. And here we can see how Kay sees Frances as a vehicle to introduce outsiders to the society in Vienna, but also to the German-speaking literary market. And she writes, for example, "Around the 22nd of September, one of my dearest friends, Annette Wedel, Danish, will come to Vienna, and she will visit you, wants to see the Frauenclub, that I mentioned before, and so you shall meet together Lou Andrea Salome at Marie Lang's." So here we can see how Kay is informing her translator of what's going to happen. She has to do this and that to please her friend. And she gives importance to this introduction to the circles of the feminist movement in Vienna. Lou Andrea Salome was known as an intellectual writer about the women's question, and Marie Lang was the editor of one of the 2 magazines that I mentioned before. And then the other side of the coin is Kay as the patron. So Kay basically promoted Frances within her own circles, and she was the one that introduced her to Selma Lagerlöf, so the Nobel Prize winner that we've mentioned already yesterday, to whom Frances became the authorized translator for short stories. And she kept doing this throughout Frances' career, facilitating her work as a translator, really. So here we have an interesting example of Kay trying to convince Frances that it's important to have an interview published in a Swedish magazine named Eden. And so she writes, first of all, send your portrait and notes so that she, a Swedish journalist, can write about you in Eden. So a women's magazine kind of publication. And then after a while, apparently Frances was not very responsive to this, so 2 weeks go by and she writes again, why have you never sent your photograph and notes to Mrs. Karin Jensen? She asks you to do it soon. And then after a couple of days, she wants to make sure that the message has passed through, so she writes again, don't forget to answer Mrs. Jensen, you got my postcard with the address indeed, didn't you? And then question mark, exclamation mark. So she really emphasizes how it's important for Frances to do this, to become known within, the Swedish readership. And she is successful. This is the article in Swedish, in the Swedish magazine Eden. Frances' portrait and then an interview with her, with the journalist Karin Jensen. And then Kay was also the way Frances had to meet the Swedish king. So Oscar II was on holiday in Croatia, at the time also part of the Habsburg Empire, and Frances was supposed to meet him, but something goes wrong, so she turns to Kay asking for her advice. What should I do? I really want to meet the king. And so Kay writes a note to a court clerk she knew, and here we have the quote, Dear Count, the young lady who leaves you this has seen Ellen Kay and most Swedish writers owe a great debt of gratitude to her, for she has introduced almost all of us to Germany, and therefore I would like you to get to know her and thank her on our behalf. And she must have been successful, because then we have Swedish and Austrian newspapers that report on the audience with the king of Frances. So quite an influent figure Kay was. Then the next category is translatorial identity / image, and here I wanted to find out what Frances' own perception was of her role, but also what kind of image she wanted to transmit to her client, and how this was perceived then by Kay and how she responded to it. Now, both of them are very knowledgeable of the market and business knowledge, and so they express this in the correspondence. The one is more knowledgeable when it comes to the Swedish market, and the other one for the German and Austrian literary markets. Here, Frances writes that there is interest in such books here as in Germany is evident. You could not go anywhere in society last winter without being asked if you had read Mrs. Leffler's book on Sonia Kowalewski, and so Mrs. Marholm's books and Le Journal de Marie Baskitsev. One had to read all this. Have you already thought about Verlag der Wiener Mode, Vienna, that published one of Marholm's books? So here she's kind of subtly implying that she knows what kind of literature is a good seller on the literary market, and she's also suggesting what publisher could be appropriate for Kay's works. Now, a sub-theme that I identified, also in this case, one side of the coin, is what I call Frances as the dedicated disciple. Why? Because Frances is always very what could I say? She admires Kay a lot, and she looks up to her And I haven't mentioned, but Kay, when they met, was quite older, around 20 years older than her. So she comes across as the mature writer with more experience, and she responds to this with a very affectionate tone, but also firm tone. And we have an example. Frances writes, "I share her views on women's nature and women's work completely, although I could never succeed in expressing them in such an excellent, convincing and brilliant way. Once again, many thanks for all your good and wise words." So I think it's clear how she feels about Kay. And we could read between the lines also that she puts herself as a translator in an inferior position compared to the author, so kind of using the stereotype of the genius, the authorial genius. And this is confirmed and reiterated throughout the correspondence. Then the other side of the coin is what I called Kay as the loving mentor, which I've already kind of mentioned. So this caring yet firm attitude is very clear, and she's very grateful for what Frances has done for her in Germany and Austria. So she writes, for example, "You are a pure treasure as a translator. You are orderly too, and that is a virtue which makes practical circumstances infinitely easier." So yeah, she appreciates the translator for sure. And then we have what I would say is a central quote, recognizing what Frances has done for her. She says, "If you had not translated me, I would not be famous now at all, ecco. Thus, I have to thank you for the matter." So, I mean, the translator had an important role, and this was even recognized by the author. Finally, the last category is that of working conditions, and in this case I think it's pretty obvious, but I just wanted to see if the correspondence revealed anything about the working conditions the translator worked in, if they evolved over time, and what affected them. And here I will just mention the sub-theme, which is quite important, and I called it "My Minion Jack of all trades and rock," because Frances' role went way beyond being a translator or cultural mediator, literary agent. She was entrusted with all sorts of tasks. So she was the one who booked a room for Kay when she came and visited in Vienna. She picked up flowers at the flower shop. She would run around to do any sort of errand. And the examples here are just to show that they really talked about their private life and their mutual acquaintances. So, for instance, Kay writes, "Give me the Herzog's address. I wanted to send them a photograph of me taken in my home, which might amuse them, perhaps." Or even, "Can you ask Baroness Hammer to be so kind as to give me 2 prints of the photo where I stand straight with my hand on the dog and my eyes downcast? She took it last summer." So, what conclusions can we draw from this? Going back to the research questions, I think it's a bit unclear if Frances' role in the bourgeois feminist movement in Vienna gave impulse to her translations, because basically both her membership in the women's associations and the contact with Kay started around the same time. So what can be said, I believe, is that she had an interest in these themes, and that's why she became a member of these associations, and she contacted Kay because she was interested in that type of literature. Then Frances definitely had an instrumental role to Kay's success in the Germanophone world, and this is shown by the merger of their 2 contact networks, becoming one shared ones, and then with the intertwinement of personal and professional and the sharing of these acquaintances in the Austrian feminist movement. And finally, Kay's patronage was also fundamental in establishing Frances' position on the literary market as a translator, also thanks to the contact network. And then this is also shown by their relationship as a disciple and a mentor. So this is all from me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I think we need more such collaborations. I don't think they've stopped. I think it's very interesting to see that they carried out, that such collaboration was possible 100 years ago and carries on. I think we all benefit. I know I benefit from such collaborations. Thank you. Okay. Now, we'll hear from Marion. Marion Lerner is, what does it say here? Works at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. Originally from Humboldt University in Berlin. Originally from East Germany, which it doesn't say in this document right here. And works on Icelandic cultural history, in particular cultural memory, national identity, modern travel culture, travel literature, and so on. He's an associate professor of translation studies at the University of Iceland ever since 2017, and is currently working on 19th and 20th century Icelandic German translations, use of paratexts in translations, and visibility of translators in target texts. Yeah. And is interested in methods applied in feminist translation studies and biographies and legacies of Icelandic German translators. And that's what we'll hear about today.
Yes.
Icelandic German
Yes,
translator.
thank you.
Yeah.
I hope you hear me quite well, because I was so lucky to catch a cold, and my voice is not the strongest today.
You have to speak right into it if you
Okay.
raise the mic.
Do you hear me well? Yes. Okay.
Even more.
Even more.
You have to kiss the mic.
Yes, yes, but I have to see. Okay. So, I also worked as a tourist guide in Iceland, so I'm used to the microphone. I hope it works well now. I live and work in Iceland. I'm German. Last week I traveled in Germany, and when I tell people where I live and what I do at the university, they always ask what language people speak in Iceland. Is it English? No, it's not. It's Icelandic. And then people are quite surprised. And we teach in Icelandic. We also teach foreign students in translation studies in Icelandic. And of course they work with Icelandic, into Icelandic, or the other way around. So, in the year 1890, the Journal of Ethno-Psychology in Berlin published a review of Icelandic folk tales. A book that had appeared in German translation the year before. In the opening sentences of this review, the author states that M. Lehmann-Filesz is most likely a woman. He goes on to declare that he strongly disapproves of women as writers and has an unshakable dislike for them, especially when they attempt things that are strictly a man's business. What he would nevertheless concede is that educated women, who usually have an inherent talent for language, are well suited for rendering foreign texts, especially if they touch on the realm of fantasy. It appears that he considers folktales to be such fantasy texts, since he judges the translation to be excellently done. But how he arrives at this judgment remains unclear. As a matter of fact, Margarete Lehmann-Filesz not only translated the folktales, but also extracted them from an extensive collection and compiled them into chapters. Yeah. She obviously presumed to possess skills beyond the mere rendering of fantasy texts. So who was Margarete Lehmann-Filesz? I recently came across her name while researching Icelandic to German translations in the period around 1885 to 1914. In German-speaking countries, older Icelandic literature had been popular for some time, but in the late 19th century there was a growing interest in contemporary literature, leading to what we would now consider an astonishing volume of translations and publications. During my research into short prose, novellas, short stories, etc., which were a new literary genre in Iceland at the time, I discovered 44 translations published in German, a remarkably high number. The translations centered on 25 Icelandic source texts by 9 authors, all of them male. Similarly, of the total of 9 translators, all were male, with one exception, Margarete Lehmann-Filles, who was responsible for 4 of the 25 translations. A search through the catalogues of German language national and university libraries for publications by Margarete Lehmann-Filles will turn up only a handful of entries. For the most part, they refer firstly to the 2 volumes of Icelandic folk tales from 1889 and 1891, and secondly, to the book Samples of Icelandic Poetry from 1894. In this book, Lehmann-Filles compiled her own translations of the works of 4 19th century Icelandic poets who are regarded as National Library icons in Iceland. Thirdly, the entries relate to a book on so-called board weaving from 1901, which was written by Lehmann-Filles after many years of ethnological research into this largely forgotten craft. A research in the catalogue of the National and University Library of Iceland, however, reveals more than 40 entries for the translator and author Margarete Lehmann-Filles, as well as the 3 books just mentioned, along with various translated short stories. The entries relate to a series of magazine articles on Icelandic cultural history, written in both German and Icelandic. At this point, I was quite surprised to find a large number of translations of scientific articles in the fields of anthropology, ethnology, geography, and geology. The initial research already indicates that Lehmann-Filles was a very versatile translator whose spectrum ranged from folktales, poetry, and short stories to cultural and natural science literature. Around 1900, Iceland was taking the first strides towards gaining independence from Denmark. We have heard about small languages before, and they all had some millions of speakers. Iceland had at the time 80,000. So 80,000 people are trying to get independence from Denmark. In Iceland, every publication abroad that referred to the country or was translated from Icelandic was noted with interest and pride and was discussed in newspapers and magazines. Translators were regarded Íslandsvinir, or friends of Iceland. People knew their names and held them in high regard. With this cultural background in mind, I turned to the catalogue of digitally archived Icelandic magazines. When I entered the name Margarete Lehmann-Filles, I was surprised to find countless mentions. This multitude of brief reports in the Icelandic media represents an important source for my work. The availability of sources in the German-speaking context, on the other hand, is considerably more limited. Nevertheless, what worked in my favor is the fact that the translator had famous relatives. Her mother, Berta Lehmann-Filles, was a successful writer, and her brother, Rudolf Lehmann-Filles, was appointed professor of astronomy at the University of Berlin in 1909. Thanks to the information available about her relatives, I could reconstruct an indirect, albeit brief biography for Margarete herself. Born in 1852, Margarete Lehmann-Filles lived in the center of Berlin with her mother, 2 aunts, and her brother. Her father had died at an early age. Although descended from Silesian landowners, the family apparently socialized with Berlin's intellectual upper middle class and even with some nobility. Together with other girls, Margarete was privately educated and also pursued private studies in mathematics and philology. She was proficient in several languages, among them Scandinavian languages. Having taught herself Icelandic, she developed a growing interest not only in Icelandic literature, but above all in Icelandic folklore. On a number of visits to Copenhagen, she had the opportunity to meet Icelanders, but ventured to the island only once in 1907. At that point, however, she was already seriously ill and could hardly leave the ship when it made landfall. This illness also prevented her from pursuing her work, which had been extremely prolific until then. Margarete died unmarried and childless in 1911. Among the Icelandic intellectuals with whom Lehmann-Filés corresponded and maintained personal friendship were Þorvaldur Thoroddsen and his wife Þóra. This friendship turned out to be a lucky break for my research. Not only did Lehmann-Filés translate many of Thoroddsen's scientific articles, she also sent her friends copies of her own texts and translations, which she often signed with a handwritten greeting. For their part, the Thorodsens collated all of the documents and filed them away. With Þorvaldur Thoroddsen emerging as one of Iceland's most influential geographers, his personal archive was donated to the National Library of Iceland after his death. The relevant folders harbor unexplored treasures, especially since many of the items have not yet been catalogued. For instance, I came across short stories and poems by Lehmann-Filés that had been published in German church magazines, proving that she too was a writer, just like her mother. I also found evidence of translations from short stories from Norwegian, as well as several obituaries of Icelandic literary figures and scholars printed in German magazines and newspapers. So the deeper I delved, the more varied her work turned out to be. All in all, I currently estimate that there are around 60 to 70 published texts. With the source material and the biography established, we can now consider what kind of translator Margarete Lehmann-Filés actually was. Even her first works show that she was by no means an invisible translator. Her name was always printed on the first page, although her female first name was sometimes omitted. Her Icelandic folktales already feature paratexts such as introductions and footnotes, which provide extra information. The target texts are riddled with Icelandic terms, which the translator explains in footnotes. These explanations mostly provide information on Icelandic customs and traditions, names and people, as well as the country's topography, flora and fauna. Readers are thus constantly reminded that they are reading a translation, and it is abundantly clear that the translator has a wealth of specialized knowledge. Lehmann-Filés usually adopted the same strategy for her translation of Icelandic short stories. Although the translated poems are not footnoted in the poetry volume, there are introductions to the poets' lives and works, so again the translator is very present. When it came to literary translations, Lehmann-Filés obviously took a confident tone from the outset. Matters were, however, different in terms of her scientific work, where we are seeing an interesting development. The second volume of the folktales included a preamble alongside the translator's foreword. This preamble was based on an introduction the Icelandic philologist Guðbrandur Vigfússon had written for the first volume of the Icelandic edition. However, a quick comparison of the text shows that the translator had fundamentally revised this scientific introduction. The original text was written in an old-fashioned, overly complicated style and contained a large number of very long quotations and numerous references to Icelandic historical figures and texts. It was obviously targeted at a highly specialized readership. The translator removed most of the long quotations, omitted almost all of the references to people, and summarized the deliberations very skillfully, using generalization and contextualization. She adapted the style to a broad, well-educated readership. On top of that, she incorporated the latest scientific findings and added a self-penned biography of Jón Árnason, collector of Icelandic folktales. So how can we classify this text? Is it a translation or an original academic work? Lehmann-Fileš herself vaguely described it as an adaptation, parts of which are true to the original. However, she did not clearly identify either herself or Guðbrandur Vigfússon as the author. In the years 1893 to 1897, the journal entitled From the Proceedings of the Berlin Anthropological Society included a total of 10 publications mentioning the name Lehmann-Fileš. What's interesting is that the journal itself referred to these texts neither as articles nor as translations. The editors introduced the first text as follows. On Mr. Bartel's suggestion, Miss Margarete Lehmann-Fileš, who is proficient in Icelandic, has taken the trouble to look through the yearbooks received by our society in the course of our exchange with the Icelandic Society for Antiquities in Reykjavik. She provides the following excerpts. So what does this mean? The introduction essentially states that a professional, probably a member of the society, is contributing texts created with the help of the language skills of a woman working in the background. I could imagine that merely mentioning the woman by name was a matter of dispute. Nothing at all is said about her academic skills. Subsequent issues published by the Berlin Anthropological Society mostly introduced the texts with the following words. Miss Margarete Lehmann-Fileš has sent a communication concerning, or has sent a report on, etc. This choice of words leaves us entirely in the dark as to whether she submitted translations or wrote contributions herself. The texts themselves, however, provide some insight into the methodology employed by Lehmann-Fileš. It consists of summarizing certain articles by Icelandic scientists and translating them, either in part or in excerpts. Increasingly, however, her approach evolved into reproducing the content of several articles and analyzing them in relation to each other. This meant that she also presented contradictory opinions referring to the respective authors in the third person. Sometime later, in the years 1896 to 1909, Lehmann-Fileš published a total of 13 texts in the Journal of the Berlin Folklore Society, which provides somewhat clearer information. For instance, one of the articles is subtitled by Ólafur Davidsson, translated from the Icelandic manuscript by Margarete Lehmann-Fileš. In this case, she contributed a straightforward translation without any changes or explanations. However, other examples also used the method described above. Preceded by the words adapted from the Icelandic by M. Lehmann-Fileš, these texts were reproductions of content. Eventually, we see articles headed by M. Lehmann-Fileš, in which the author refers to her own writing with the words "in my essay." In addition, there are shorter articles without titles or subtitles, which are signed by Margarete Lehmann-Fileš. In the period 1894 to 1909, 1919 translations and articles were published in various popular and illustrated scientific journals such as The Globe, Heaven and Earth, Overseas and Natural Science Review. These publications at last clearly state the respective type of text as well as the author or translator. The majority of the articles are written by Thorvald Thoroddsen and translated by Liman Filej from Icelandic or Danish, sometimes directly from the manuscript. They present specialist natural science material using the appropriate technical vocabulary. Comments by the translator are rare and mostly concern information regarding the origins of the texts. On top of this, Liman Filej also detailed reviews of botanical and agricultural works published in Iceland. And finally, there are articles on natural and cultural science topics in which Liman Filej herself appears as the author. If we look at the above methodology in chronological order, we can discern a linear development. True to the female tradition, Liman Filej initially appeared to be working in the background. Whether willingly or unwillingly, she placed her knowledge of Icelandic at the disposal of her male colleagues. Little by little, however, she also revealed her own scientific expertise and finally claimed the right to judge the research she reported on, compare results, and provide comments. Nevertheless, it took some time before her texts were no longer simply referred to as communications or reports. In the end, she emerged as an expert translator and a competent academic author. In summary, it can be stated that this partially reviewed archive material already serves as a strong basis for the exploration of interdependencies between literary, academic, and translation activities, using the example of one female professional. However, the material also raises fundamental questions on how these interdependencies are determined and shaped by gender. And finally, it remains to be established which freedom of action individuals can acquire in the face of massive structural obstacles, and how they can retain control or assert their agency. For all that, Margarethe Liman Filej must have been an unusually interesting woman who bravely pursued her intellectual interests with single-minded determination. It would have been a great honor to meet her. Thank you.
We are meeting her 100 years later. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Are there questions, responses, reactions to these ladies from the late 19th century to who were very active, that we know nothing about until now?
No? Thing is, I wouldn't be surprised if they had known of each other.
Yeah.
Your translator and my translator.
Absolutely.
Because Margarethe Liman Filej also published in the magazine that Helene Lange edited in Berlin. So maybe they knew of each other.
Maybe by name, yeah. I could not find any correspondence between them.
No.
Have you? No.
No.
So.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, for me at least, of all those other 100-year-old, 150-year-old feminist movements. I don't know that Margarethe would have called herself a feminist, but certainly the two Viennese and Swedish women were, as if it all stopped, disappeared, and then started again 50 years later. It didn't. It kept going. Yeah. It's good to hear about. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for lunch? No?